Thank you and warmly welcome to this webinar, Common Security, the way forward when the order is falling. I'm very honored to be the host of this seminar or webinar, I should say. But before I welcome the participants and thank the organizers, I might only present myself so you know who I am. My name is Jytte Guteland. I'm a member of the European Parliament and I work in the Environmental Committee every day with climate-related policies. And I am very eager to present this panel that we have and the panelists because we have a very good panel, I believe, to talk about this important topic. I'm honored to present Margot Wallström, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sweden, and she has also been the EU Commissioner from Sweden and worked with the topics that I work with every day. And I'm really honored to have you in this panel and looking forward to listen to you. We have Cedric de Koning, a research professor, NUP, South Africa, with us here today. I would also like to welcome you, as eager to listen to your developments on this important subject. And of course, we have Anna Sundström, the General Sorry, when did you stop hearing you? When did you stop hearing me? I'm very sorry.
When you had presented me.
Okay, thank you.
You had presented me, but then we couldn't hear you anymore.
We go into the subject now, and somehow the mic stopped working. I don't know why. I'm very sorry. The world stands at crossroads at this moment. The choice is between an existence based on confrontation, aggression, ecological disorder, or one rooted in peace, sustainability, and common security. We have the choice now. Human faces the existential threats of nuclear war, climate collapse, and pandemics. That's where we are. The upcoming environmental conference, Stockholm 50 Plus, is about combining environmental action with social goals of Agenda 2030. Focusing on the concept of common security can help the conference to join the dots between the work for peaceful world and the protection of our living environment. So it could not be more timely to have the Stockholm 50 Plus conference than the era that we live in now. I would then like to take this opportunity to get our very fine panelists to go into the topics. And I will start with Anna Sundström. And I would be have an answer that is very basic here. So I will ask you directly, what is common security? And what was said in the report recently presented by the Common Security 22? Anna, could you enlighten us?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jytte. Happy and honored, of course, to be here in this webinar to focus on these very important issues. And for your question, what is common security? Actually, the basic idea is very, very simple. It's about nations and populations not feeling safe when their counterparts do not feel safe. So that security is a feeling that we obtain and that we share together. No country can obtain its security in the long run simply by taking unilateral decision about its own military deployment, and that security depends, of course, also on the actions and the reactions of your potential adversaries. So therefore, security must be found in common with those adversaries, your neighbors or potential other actors. So, and the concept itself, it was developed at the height of the Cold War by the Independent Commission on Disarmament and Security Issues, and it was chaired by Olof Palme in the 1980s. The concept itself, it's based on a number of principles, including that all nations have a right to security, that military force is not a legitimate means for resolving disputes between the nations, and that reductions and limits on arms are necessary for mutual security. So this report, it was launched 40 years ago, when of course the relationships between the superpowers at that time was at rock bottom, and the risk of a devastating nuclear war was very, very high. The introduction of the concept of common security showed that security is something that we must create together, and more powerful weapons are not the answer. Well, today we find ourselves again at the same crossroad as you said, faced with a choice between an existence based on confrontation and aggression, or one rooted in a peace agenda and common security. So to also mark the 40th anniversary, so to say, of the launch of the report on common security in 1982, this year, or actually last year, the Olof Palme Center, together with the International Peace Bureau and the International Trade Union Confederation, put together our own commission, a new commission. And over the year, we've looked into the concept of common security. We took it as our starting point. And this initiative, Common Security 2022, as we called it, has then analyzed the world we live in today and some of the great threats facing humanity as of today. Of course, in the 1980s, we had as one existential threat to humanity, namely the risk of nuclear war. But today, we face two existential threats to humanity. We still have the risk of nuclear war, of course, but added to this also the effects of climate change and loss of biodiversity. So with this as our starting point, we have also analyzed other sort of threats to security or challenges to security, like the democratic backslide the world has been facing now for around 2 decades, the growing inequality, and so on. And what we've then done is that we've sort of updated the concept of common security. We stand firm on the basic original principles, so to say, but we've also then developed a few other, 6 new principles to common security, focusing on the interlinkages also between, common security and human security, making sure that human security is integrated into the concept of common security. Also, a principle around the need for the rebuilding of trust between nations and peoples, and also the linkages between nuclear disarmament, the limitations on conventional weapons, and reduced military expenditure that would make it possible to also invest in development instead of armament, so to say, and that we need that kind of space or that funding to invest in development, making sure that also trust is regained, that development also, of course, we know that development, there is no peace without development, nor development without peace. We also focus on regional and global cooperation, the need to strengthen multilateralism, the need to, of course, prevent conflict. And that also, of course, clearly links to the need to address climate change as a way of also preventing conflicts. As we know, and I'm sure Margot will also talk more about this, how climate and climate change and the effects of climate change are also a major driver of conflict, social tension, and migration. But we've also looked into the need to also strengthen international law and strengthen, not the least, respect for international law and responsible governance. We have, I think, we've shared in the chat box the link to the report. In the report, we also present 25 quite concrete proposals on how to restore the global world order so to enable us to also face and to handle these challenges that we as humans face on this planet. The international order, as you said, is simply not working well enough, and we have to fix it. And we believe that the notion of common security can also guide us on this path, so to say, finding our way back to cooperation and to handle and solving the challenges we face in common.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for the presentation of the report. Listening to you, it's like a sane voice in a chaotic world, and also how you describe the report with all the proposals on how we can tackle it and get back to some normal order, but also, of course, the transition when it comes to the global challenges that we have at this moment to sustainability is extremely important and valuable. And I think many would like to read it now after your presentation, if not before. I would like to go to the other panelists as well. And you, Anna, will come back into this discussion. But I will start now with Margot Wallström and give the floor to you. I would like to ask you, Margot, with all your experience in politics and also on the international level, you're definitely the one to ask. How would you say that the common security relates to the climate and ecological crisis that we are developing? How it is interlinked, the crisis, and how do they relate to each other? And what thoughts do you bring into this from your experience? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jytte. Thank you, Anna, for inviting me to this webinar. And it is very timely because just a few days ago we presented the CPRI report, Environmental Peace, and I've had the honor to lead the international advisory panel for this project. And I've said all the time that we have kind of a date with history this year, 50 years after the first Stockholm conference, the first UN conference on how to protect the environment. And my impression is that since then, the kind of, if I call it traditional environmental policies, have ended up kind of in the shadow of the bigger crisis, which is the climate crisis, but also overshadowed by sort of the darkening security horizon as well. And we are, in this report, we are describing the twin crisis, both the security crisis with over the past 10 years, the number of armed conflicts have doubled, and so has the number of deaths because of armed conflict. And also that global military spending now exceeds $2 trillion US dollars. So there is a militarization of this world, and more conflicts and more deaths because of armed conflicts, but also the multifaceted acute environmental crisis that we see, and it is of course exacerbated by climate change. It is made worse by climate change because we have a species extinction that is 10 to 100 times faster than in the last 10 million years. We have lost between 60 to 75% of the world's biomass since 1970, and also 1/3 of the soil worldwide is degraded. I remember listening to a representative from Somalia explaining that they used to have between 60 and 75% of their sort of land covered by vegetation, and now it's down to 18%. And of course, this will create in turn also in time also a human crisis. And this is what we are seeing because the number of refugees has doubled in a very short time, and we see that the effects of course losing access to water or being able to feed a growing population can lead to, or will lead in many cases, a social unrest, which can then turn into a conflict and in the end even to an armed conflict. And meanwhile, we see that the response to this also from the international community has not been effective enough. And you will know this very well, but the most fragile states in the world, they have received 1/80th of the climate financing per capita that flows to non-fragile states. So we are not sort of directing the money, the financing of addressing to adapt or to mitigate climate change to those who need it the most, but rather maybe those who are the loudest, and this of course cannot do. So there is clearly a link already, and we have a number of case studies demonstrating also that climate change exacerbating already existing environmental problems in many countries, and how that will affect also the security situation. And unfortunately, we are in a situation now where more and more countries, because of the ongoing war and the barbaric war that we see in Ukraine, has led so many countries to invest even more on their military budgets and the military spending, and unfortunately cutting instead humanitarian assistance or development budgets. And this is of course a very, very serious situation for the world if we look a few years forward. And I can quickly also say that I tried to summarize our recommendations, because as with Anna's report and what she presented, we also established a few sort of guiding principles, but also some recommendations. And if I sum them up, it would be that the world has to step up, build up, link up, pay up, look up, and of course never give up. That is the most important. And with this we just mean that you have to present measures that helps to deal with environmental problems, and at the same time they have to address also security issues and vice versa. You have to build up by investing in preparedness and resilience, looking at the risks for the future. And you have to do more of transboundary agreements, for example, on water management. You have to link up, and that simply reinforces what Anna said about countries having to work together. So cooperation is the rule. You have to look up because there can also be negative social impacts and effects of and conflict risks from what you do. And we see it also with new investments in mining, for example, opening mines. So you have to do it in a proper way by being deliberately inclusive. You have to listen to those people directly affected by these reforms and changes, and pay up, finance peace and less sort of weapons and militarization, and never give up. That is also clearly, it's not hopeless. We can still make important changes for this world, and I hope that Stockholm Plus 50 will also be an opportunity for those who see that we have to do more to reinforce our democratic foundations. We have to work together. We have to support our international organizations and the multilateral approach, and we have to sort of take measures that are effective enough to deal with these both crisis and the deficit that it has created.
Thank you, Margot. Also to you for explaining how we can tackle the situation we live in, and also with your experience. But I also like how you add some of the obstacles that we have to also complicate the discussion with. It's not as easy as there is one way to go, but we also need to see that we have different angles also to the solutions. So really interesting. And I would now invite Cedric to the very same question. I would like you also to say how you relate the common security and ecological and climate crisis. And maybe you can also mention, like Margot did, your view on the report, the environment of peace that you were working on with CIPRI together with Margot. She mentioned it, and maybe you would also like to add some words on your work there. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jette, and absolute pleasure to be here together with Margot and Anna. Thank you for the invitation. I think Margot has introduced and summarized the Environment of Peace report very well. So maybe I'll just emphasize one aspect, which I think is common to both the Common Security and the Environment of Peace report. And that is that perhaps the predominant characteristic of the situation that we currently have to manage is the fact that we are dealing with multiple crises happening at the same time. It's a bit like this film that's currently on the circuit that is called Everything Everywhere All at Once. So we've got the COVID-19 climate change crisis, increased US-China tensions, refugee crisis with increasing unprecedented numbers. Also, many people dying, crossing the Mediterranean, trying to reach Europe. Escaping from conflicts in Syria, in the Sahel, and Yemen. We now have the Russian war in Ukraine. Anna emphasized the weakening of the nuclear disarmament regime. And of course, overall, the fact that we're dealing with increased polarization and tension among great and regional powers. And with that, the weakening of the multilateral system. So this all combines to create a very complex situation. And recently I listened to a talk by Jean-Paul Lederach, one of our authorities in the peacebuilding field, and he explained that complexity emerged from a combination of multiplicity, many different things, and simultaneity happening at the same time. And this is why I think one of the core principles and recommendations coming out of the Environment of Peace report was that we need to expect the unexpected. We need to be prepared to adapt. We know the risk landscape will evolve, so our responses also need to be flexible and adaptive. And this complexity, this uncertainty is no excuse for inaction. We need to, at the same time, act and learn and adapt as we go along. So let me stop there and back to you, Jette.
Thank you, Cedric, and I will get back to you very soon to explain even more on that, and also a little bit on what's happening in both South Africa but also the African Union. But before I do that, I would like to invite Anna, also listening to the other panelists and from your presentation. Do you have conclusions or thoughts that you would like to share also on this question on how we relate the crisis together?
No, just to underline what has already been said, that this is a multiple challenge, a challenge with many aspects, and that we need to sort of address them also both together, of course, but also at the same time. And to see how they are also very much intertwined and interlinked, and that the one feeds the other, so to say. Like, for example, the democratic backslide that we see is, of course, also a reaction to growing inequalities and so on. But it also undermines the multilateral system as it gives way or gives space for populist, nationalistic politicians and movements winning elections by putting their own nation first, etc. And that kind of political force is the exact opposite to what we need right now. We need political forces that really puts, cooperation and also the global cooperation at center, because we cannot solve these challenges that we face on our own from a national perspective. It needs to be handled in global cooperation. So, and this is also why it's so very important to also, as Margot was talking about, sort of invest also in these structures. So just to underline the importance of to see how this is intertwined and how we must face it together.
Yes, and that is really adding a complexity to this. In the time when we need the multilateralism to work better than ever, it seemed to be very under attack and not functioning as it should. And I think one example is the resolution on climate security that was vetoed in the Security Council, though Russia was against it. And this is really depressing, actually. But in comparison, the African Union sees no contradiction in having a position that addresses both the climate change issues and its effect on peace and security. How come the African Union has come to this conclusion, and how should the African Union and nations and the civil society work in order to integrate peace and climate? And this question is to you, Cedric.
Thank you, Jette. I think two issues perhaps help to explain the situation. The one is climate change politics, and the other one is the controversy around the causal link between climate change and conflict. On climate change politics, I think the countries that are opposed to climate security being on the agenda of the Security Council argue that the issue is and should be dealt with by the parts of the UN system or the international system that is responsible for climate change, like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the COP process, where every country has an equal say. And the irony is that I think none of the countries that want to see climate security being addressed by the Security Council disagrees with this notion. I think no one wants Trump or Putin to be able to veto the Paris Agreement or other subsequent COP decisions that countries take together. So I think the the problem here is a kind of a misunderstanding of what it is that climate security means at the Security Council. Because the countries that want the Security Council to address climate security, and that's actually the majority of countries, the resolution that Russia vetoed in December had 123 co-sponsors, the second most in the history of the UN Security Council. So what these countries want is the Security Council to only address those issues where climate change has an impact on peace and security. So for instance, how UN peacekeeping operations should ensure that they can carry out their mandated tasks like protection of civilians or humanitarian assistance, support to humanitarian assistance, despite disruptions like a major, let's say, extreme weather event like flooding, or how they should take into their analytical and planning capabilities, how this should take into account that some conflicts can be caused by resource scarcity. So for instance, conflict between farmers and herders in South Sudan, and how they should take that into account in their planning. So these are the kind of things that the Security Council is responsible for, which we wouldn't want to add further to the burden of the UNFCCC or those UN bodies. And this debate that we have at the Security Council does not exist within the African Union or the African Union Peace and Security Council, because we don't have this north-south or east-west division about climate change politics, and where one bloc or another bloc has an opposing view. There's one common position. Africa negotiates more or less as one when it comes to the climate change process, but also there's a common position on climate security being developed ahead of COP27. And then on the causal link, those that oppose the climate security agenda point to the findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that found that there's no direct or automatic link between climate change and conflict. And this is based on a misunderstanding. The fact that climate and conflict is interlinked does not mean that there's a direct or predetermined causal effect. I mean, I would say the bottom line is that the climate does not change conflict, people do. Or sorry, the climate does not cause conflict, people do. So it's always about how people react to the additional stress by climate change. For instance, how it impacts on their water and food security. So you can have extreme weather that cause flooding or drought, or it can also be slower changes that make some crops or forms of livestock or farming or fishing no longer sustainable. But we find that in the environmental peace-building research, that most people cooperate under stress, including under resource scarcity. So it's not that once we have climate change and or resource scarcity, that there will be automatically conflict. And this is the important distinction. At the same time, it doesn't mean that in some instances, people may choose to use violent conflict as a coping mechanism for securing scarce resources. So the fact that the link is on average weak does not mean that the link is weak in specific cases where we do find that kind of linkage quite clearly. And I think this is the other difference between Africa and the Security Council, because in the African context, many of the countries experience these interconnections firsthand, and therefore making this link is uncontroversial in the African context or in the context of the African Union Peace and Security Council. Thank you. Back to you, Jetta.
Thank you, Cedric, and very interesting knowledge that that you mentioned, that when we are under threat, there is no immediate connection to go into the conflict. You can actually react also on the transition needed, and that is also something that we see, and that gives some hope also to that we can actually accelerate the work because we are going to have more threats under the global heating. Thank you. I would like all of you also to say a few words on something that has been touched upon, but that needs to be very outspoken in politics if too succeed, and that's the resistance. It has been touched upon, and not at least now by Cedric, but when we have a transition, there will be resistance. And who is in this transition with the proposals that you have shared with us today on what's needed to have new order in this more chaotic situation that we are in now? Who will be against and why? And who are the winners and maybe the ones who have more problems if we go into a more sustainable solution and do the things that you find necessary? Who will be against? I think we need to sort that out to be able to also address and make bridges to walk on for the society and for the states, the nations in the world. Margot, will you start?
Thank you very much, and allow me to just comment shortly on what Cedric very wisely pointed out. I think first of all, very important that the Security Council continues to ask peacekeeping missions to report, and also the UN bodies, of course, to report back to the Security Council, to understand what it is that they should be on the lookout for. So to identify some of these environmental and climate change risks early on that can later on lead to tensions and social unrest. And we are in a situation already where actually most of the peacekeeping missions that the UN has deployed, they are present in countries that are also highly exposed to climate change impacts. So that is not a coincidence. But this is, of course, difficult. How to train sort of our UN staff to understand, to scan the horizon, to understand what is it that we should look for, and how do we report it back to headquarters. But that has already started in a few cases, and I think that this is very, very important to continue. And we need also to make sure that we strengthen those mechanisms that we have within the UN system to better understand and analyze the situation. So this is just in addition to what Cedric just said. And I've been thinking a lot about how do we take the findings in our reports further. I believe we need, and I will argue for that and advocate for that, I think we need a few pilot countries that we can work with. I would say with governments who are sort of friendly towards this approach, that are willing to embrace the kind of analysis and to do something with it, and also countries where both the UN has a presence, and I would say countries that can help with some money and some budgets as well. But also, how do we win popular support for these the changes and the reforms? And sometimes even how do we convince or how do we get people to understand what we are saying in those reports? How will they understand sort of the effects? And we have said in our report, Environment of Peace, that you have to make sure that you can listen very carefully to first and foremost indigenous groups that often have the best of knowledge and insight and often also think long term, and to get them involved in important changes. But how do we do in a country like Yemen, where they grow khat, which is a drug and not for sort of human consumption? It's not food, but it requires so much water to grow. And how do you change that if it takes a lot of land and water to do it? How? And then this is of course something that goes deep into the culture. but they would really need to grow something better than this drug in their countries. How do you do that? And I don't have the answer. I'm just mentioning it as one of the examples. And what we can see is, of course, also when with climate change and with less water and precipitation, for example, there can be those conflicts between farmers and herders, and this is already a fact also in, for example, the Sahel area. So by force and by the force of nature, people will end up in sort of in a situation that can easily become conflictual. So these are just some of the difficult challenges and questions we will have to deal with from now on, because this report as well, it's only as good as its implementation, and if it just collects dust on a shelf somewhere, it will not help anyone. So we have to find a way to implement it and start something, and hopefully we can do that maybe with a few pilot countries. And I think the same goes for Anna's report. I call it your report, Anna, but Olof Palme Center report, and together with others. So how do we place this in real life? And lastly, 50 years ago, before the Stockholm conference, Silent Spring, the book, was published. And that, of course, helped everyone to wake up to an environmental threat, an environmental problem. And it came very close to everybody. Will we never hear sort of the birds sing in spring in the future? What on earth? We have to do something about this. And I think we have to find those examples that people will understand will affect their sort of daily lives or the lives of their children. And as the psychologists say, it has to take shape as an enemy that we are able to fight. And that is also quite a difficult task, but I believe that is true, because climate change has been very much for the natural scientists and not the behavioral scientists. But now maybe we have to ask, how can we improve our understanding of how this will affect our lives in a way that we define it as an enemy. Sorry for being long, but this is something I think about almost every day. How can we, because that will make us willing to act, and that is what is missing right now. We have all the knowledge, we have the science, but we are not doing enough.
Thank you, Margot, and thank you for bringing up some concrete examples of the resistance and also the need to have it in front of us to see the problems and have it visual to make it more concrete. I will ask the same question to Cedric and Anna, but I will actually add, when you describe the resistance, maybe the powers that are against for different reasons who could be turned around, I think myself also of stranded assets, of investments in fossil fuels and gas that would be stranded assets. But I think the example that Margot brought up on the drugs, plants and plantations is extremely important. These kind of, who are they and why are it so hidden, and why is it behind maybe the put pressure on the political decisions, but not so visual in the public debate. But I would like to add to this question, the last questions that I have is also what advice you have. And Margot, you will get a small sentence in the end here also on that, for the Stockholm Plus 50 conference. What should be done? Who should do that? and when? So this is also adding to the question, and I think both you, Cedric, and Anna will be able to do the two questions in combination, and then Margot will come in the end. Cedric, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I think the fact that there isn't this automatic clear link gives us, as you mentioned before, an opportunity to actually influence the impact of climate change by investing in resilience, by reducing vulnerability, and to do this through investments in mitigation and adaptation. So I think there's a lot that we can do. I think one thing I would like to highlight as a risk in this context and as a response to climate change is not just climate change itself, but the transition that we are now embarking on to, over the next 2 to 3 years, reach our Paris Agreement goals. Because I think what that means is that a significant amount of funding will be directed towards climate adaptation in the coming years. Millions of dollars of climate adaptation funding is going to be spent. And for me, the critical question is whether these funds will be spent in a way that contribute to peace or not. And part of that is influenced by the resistance that you mentioned. So how we go about spending this money can either cause harm or, including perhaps even trigger conflict, or it can contribute to sustaining peace. So it can be a double-edged sword. And I think we need to think here about the fact that this is not just a technical issue. It's not just urgent to spend this money, but we need to take the time to think through how it will be received, who will be the winners and losers, who will resist and why. And I think one important aspect is not just that we think of people who resist as somebody criminal or evil, but many people may be causing harm out of goodwill, thinking that they're acting in the right way and for the sake of the environment, but approaching the problem too technically and not making enough effort and not involving the right stakeholders to make sure that it's not harmful. And this is why some of the key recommendations of the Environment of Peace report is precisely that we need to be deliberately inclusive, involving marginalized groups fully in the decision making, and so that we can deliver a just and peaceful transition. And so I think one of the last things to say to answer your question for me is that, building on what I said earlier, that uncertainty should not be an excuse for inaction. We need to cope by this complexity by developing smarter ways of what we call doing whilst learning, or learning whilst doing, right? So whilst we act, we need to at the same time invest in learning from what we are doing, pick up, for instance, on unintended consequences or negative consequences, adapt, address them, so that as we go forward, we don't leave those mistakes to grow on their own. So we need to think fast, we need to think ahead whilst acting at the same time. This is some of the core messages of the Environment of Peace report. And that means also that we need to educate and inform, we need to do more research so that we can understand and communicate the risks, but also build cooperation through education. And in this way, as we do whilst learning, we create at the same time the knowledge that helps us to master these challenges as we move ahead. So it's not as if we need to have all the answers from the beginning. We can develop them as we go along. Thank you very much.
Thank you also to you. And I must say that you speak about something that's extremely topic also, or timely in the European Parliament, because at this moment we speak about the climate package, and the resistance is to be more ambitious is not always about being against climate or being extremely negative or having being a bad person. It's about not being involved in the discussions on what it actually means, some of the resistance, and how it sums up together, and what your piece is adding. Very interesting. Now, Anna, the floor is yours, and you heard the question, and you also very much prepared ahead of this important Stockholm conference. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And well, briefly first on resistance. I think, of course, there is a resistance at many levels. We know that there, from some political forces, is also a very strong resistance on high level. And I think to this aspect, it's interesting to note that the VDEM Varieties of Democracy Institute at Gothenburg University, through their research has showed that actually there's a very clear linkage between the ability of democracies or Democrats to also address climate change. And with more of democracy and more of democracies in the world, we would actually be better also equipped to tackle climate change. So there is here a very strong linkage between these sort of nationalist, populist movements and lack of ability to address climate change. I think this is an important aspect for all of us voters, of course, going to vote, to have with us. And this, of course, also very clearly links to the resistance among maybe parts of populations that also sort of are attracted by these simplified populist messages around, well, of course, fear for their own jobs or whatever. And therefore, I would like to link back to what also Cedric was underlining, and I know it's also in the report, highlighted in the report, the opportunity that we now also face in the transition needed to also make sure that it's just. So to raise more public support and also more public awareness around this opportunity that we now have to also fix other issues. And then we come back to what we said initially, that this is a multi-faceted crisis, and we therefore need to also be able to act on a variety of challenges at the same time, because we also have a crisis of inequality, but the transition, a green transition that is also just, will also help us address the issues of inequality, which would then maybe hopefully gain more of support, public support, and less public resistance towards the necessary transition. So what do I hope from well, the Stockholm Plus 50 conference? I think that one aspect of this that we have touched upon a bit, the example, of course, from Yemen, and you mentioned the fossil industry, so to say, yourself, is of course also the fact that our economies have also been constructed in a way that they've sort of gained from destroying our climate, and this needs to stop. We must find a way to build what economic to increase our economies, or build our economies around green industry, so to say. And this aspect is, of course, extremely important, and I hope that the conference will also take some steps in regards to this. And there's, of course, the proposal on ecocide on the floor, on the table, which we addressed in one of the other webinars from the Olof Palme Center, to make sure that international legislation prevents economic gains from the destruction of our climate, just as one example. But also the aspect of the linkages between, of course, security, and how we might, through the aspects or the tools of common security, or the principles of common security, will also be able to address, to strengthen security through also mitigating climate change. That is also one hope that I have, that we can also see some concrete results around this. I think what Margot also initially mentioned, that it's a sort of a visit from history, is quite a powerful message, because we know at the conference in 1972, both of these aspects were also raised, and I think that we must be honest to ourselves and say that we have not acted in a way in the way that we should have during these 50 years. But we now must make a pledge to really make sure to act now. And then coming back to the CPRI report, we must act. We have all the information we need to act, but we must be bold enough to act and to try again, and maybe do some mistakes, but then learn from them and continuously act and sort of not wait, because we do not have the time to wait anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for those wise words, and also for being very concrete on the expectations for the Stockholm 50 Plus conference. I really believe your engagement for the conference is crucial, and that it will give energy to the important talks. And I would like now to hand over to Margot again, because you didn't get the chance to give your advice on what should be talked about, but also I see the conference as a step in the right direction, and that step, even if there are not big decisions, it can be important steps. So it can be promises from participations that we will do this, and this is what we wish for and what we will work for in our nations. And I wonder, Margot, who should do what and when and what? So give your advice.
Well, I guess we are all struggling to find some hope in this very dark and bleak reality that we live in today. But only one Earth was the motto 50 years ago. And I would be extremely happy if I would see that all of those government representatives that come to Stockholm revise the environmental policies, to agree that they can do something about environmental policy. I think we have to return or come down to the very necessary reforms that deal with water, air quality, waste, biodiversity, all of those things, because we can share a lot of good experience and knowledge and technology and what have you. So this is still possible to do. We have to do it. We have to make sure that we change deforestation and desertification, for example. We have to restrict our use of water and so on, or misuse of water. And maybe it is, as Ivan Klima wrote in his book, Love and Garbage, once upon a time, he said, of all the garbage that swamps us and threatens us by its breath of decay, the most dangerous is the masses of discarded ideas. So I think we just need to have new ideas and share also the good examples with each other, and find a way to review and revise and revitalize our environmental policies, and then we would have really achieved something. They have to leave the superpower fights at home and instead look at what can we do together, because it's the only way to gain hope for the future, and that's what we need the most. And maybe place children at the center of the conference also, and look at their chances to survive on this planet.
Thank you, Margot. And I think you gave hope, all of you in the panel, to the future. And the name of this webinar was The Common Security, the Way Forward When the World Order is Falling. I really believe that this panel, this excellent panel, gave us some advice on how we can do that, what way we should go, and how we can start rebuilding both trust in the multilateralism, but also steps to sustainable, secure society where we tackle the climate change and the ecological crisis. Thank you so much. There is no room for a big summary. Maybe that's a good thing for me, because it would have been a great task to actually try to sum this up. But I know that I will take with me the thoughts that you were presenting here, and they will make me more enlightened and give me more advice in my role. But I believe, and more importantly, that the people who listened and who were here today hopefully got the same feeling from this excellent panel, and that you will engage in the talks and in the political debate, and also with neighbors in the society and maybe in your company, to a good, better, more sustainable world order. And all that said, thank you to our hosts of today's panel webinar. I'm very, very honored to have been moderating this. And thank you, and see you in the upcoming talks also on Stockholm +50 conference. Goodbye, everyone.